All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott from Jeff Teaches Programming. It's been a while since I posted, and what I'd like to start to do now is talk a little bit about ASP.NET and where we're going to go with the rest of the rest of the C# lectures I'm going to do in this series. So let me get this out of the way. Now I'm going to start a little bit differently than I planned. I saw this article online. So it's from IDS Logic, and as you can see, it's over 10 years old. All right, but what it does is they mentioned in here, ASP.NET offers 3 major frameworks for creating different apps. So what I'd like to do is very slowly, very carefully, whatever, is explain what's on here. All right, probably the easiest way to do this is ASP.NET web pages with Razor syntax. All right, as they say, it's a programming platform that helps to create web apps. Okay, then there's web forms, part of the ASP.NET web application framework, rather. Web forms are pages that the user requests using their browser and can be written using a combination of client, script, server controls, HTML, and server code. Finally, the last one, which is probably the most complex, all right, is using MVC, or what's known as Model View Controller. As it says, it splits an application into 3 components: the model, the view, and the controller. Now, believe it or not, we've already dealt with at least a couple of these, and in a way, all 3 of these. The model is what you're trying to show. Basically, it kind of equates to the database. All right. The view is what we've been using in the past. Those are our forms. And the controller is kind of what we have done with the, for example, in the last program, the PayrollDB context and the PayrollDB context factory, because we use those basically as an intermediary between the database and the form. Well, that's what a controller does. It's an intermediary between the model and the view, because technically the model and the view are never supposed to really converse, so to speak, with one another. All right, everything they do between, or is done through, the controller. Now it says in a nutshell, the 3 frameworks have their own features and functionalities. Okay, and that's true. So I went out to learn.microsoft.com for ASP.NET, and there's the overview. Now notice kind of what I just mentioned: websites and web applications, web forms, MVC, and web pages. Now what I've decided, good, bad, indifferent, right, wrong, is I'm going to use the MVC, the Model View Controller architecture. As they say, it gives you a powerful pattern-based way to build dynamic websites that enable a clean separation of concerns and full control over markup. Yeah. Now, if we look on here, if I go down to the bottom, what you'll notice is there's additional resources. All right, there's other things that you can look at in here. Well, who cares? Well, the next one that I brought up was this from learn.microsoft.com. ASP.NET MVC. Now, I'm not going to go over a bit of this, but I did want you to see that it's out there. There's even, as it says, MVC video training, if you want that. Okay, I'm not going to go through any of that. But notice in here, there is an ASP.NET getting started. Learn about ASP.NET MVC, etc. Well, that's this one, and it is really extensive. I started going through it. It goes through controllers, it goes through views, it goes through models, etc. All right, so that's the stuff that we're going to be discussing in here. Now, I also found this, the complete ASP.NET Core MVC tutorial. Now, I'm not going to spend the $10, but you can download the entire thing, or you can open it up, a thing at a time. Notice it says it consists of 73 articles where you learn to make your own web apps using ASP.NET Core and the MVC framework. All right, it says they recommend you start from the beginning. Well, if we start the tutorial, I just want to go over, as you see in here, what's at the beginning. All right, so what do we have? MVC stands for Model View Controller. As it says, it's a software pattern that was developed in the 70s when graphical user interfaces were starting. It strives to separate an application into three areas. The model, as it says, this is where the data and the business logic is stored. In a typical web application, this would represent a database, all right, or anything else that the application deals with. So that's the model. We've already got that. Then there's the view. As it says, the view is the actual representation of your model. In a typical web app, this would be the page that shows your model to the user. All right. Now, what we've done in the past is we have created a C# application. We did not create an ASP.NET application. What's the difference? Well, we're going to actually get rid of, so to speak, our two forms when we do this one. We're not going to be using two forms, is what I'm telling you. All right, we're going to be creating views. Finally, the controller, as it says, should handle all the communication between the model and the view. All right, now notice they have a bunch of related topics, MVC step-by-step and MVC app step-by-step, etc. All right, and I'm sure, because I started going through this looked like this was really well done. All right, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through. I've got this book, because back when I was teaching, and I've got a whole class that I taught in ASP.NET Core MVC, basically using this book. Now, I don't know if I can find it right now, but I'm going to try anyway. So if I go out to github.com, I wasn't even going to do this, /JP Scott Rankin, I think it was. Yep, that's me, if you've ever wondered, in all my glory, so to speak. And you'll notice, what do we have there now? And don't go to any of this stuff. That's where I used to work, okay? But if we look in here, repositories, 307. All right? So there's a lot of stuff that's in here. Feel free to look at, use anything you want with any of it. Notice there's a bunch of C# stuff, etc. Somewhere in this mess, and it is a mess, but somewhere in here, there is a whole class full of stuff that was done for ASP.NET. All right, so you'd have to take a look for it. I'm not sure exactly where it is, to be honest with you. But maybe it would be, no, and I think these are done time-wise, so I can't tell you exactly where they'd be. But if you look through here, again, if you go out to github.com/JP Scott Rankin, you can start looking for them yourselves if you have an interest. All right, so with that said, I'm going to go through right now, start to go through Chapter 1 of this ASP.NET Core MVC book. Let's see where we are for time. All right, we're under 10 minutes, so hopefully I can get through most, if not all, of the chapter in here. All right. You can get these two chapters that I'm going to go over, you can get them for free by going out to Murach, that's MURACH, as you see right here, .com, and registering. Doesn't cost anything. They do need an email address from you. All right. So this is Chapter 1. Yeah, they say what people think about their book. But I want to go through, this is what I basically want to spend some time on. Okay? Take most of the page for this. This section presents, I should say, the essential skills for coding, testing, and debugging in ASP.NET Core MVC application. Chapter 1 introduces you to concepts and terms that you need to use for ASP.NET Core MVC programming. In Chapter 2, you actually develop a simple app, which is a single page. We're going to do both of those. Now, again, I have the book, but I don't have access to the PDF for anything other than chapters 1 and 2. So I'm not going to go over chapter 3 or chapter 4. But I do, even though we don't have it a PDF, I do want to talk a little bit about what's in chapter 5, because they talk about how to test and debug. All right. So with that said, I'm just going to start with chapter 1. As it says, the chapter introduces you to basic concepts of web programming and ASP.NET Core MVC. You will not become an expert by going through these 2 chapters. You will not become an expert by going through what I have. Like I said, I had an entire 16 or 18 week, whatever it was, course on this. All right. But we will learn in here how the web apps work, how the Core MVC apps work, and the software you need to do this. It'll be a start. So it starts with an introduction to web pages, goes through the differences between static and dynamic web pages, introduces the MVC or model view controller pattern. Then there's actually an introduction to ASP.NET Core MVC. They talk about the tools. We're going to be using Visual Studio, not Visual Studio Code, so that part I'm going to skip. And finally, the chapter ends with how an ASP.NET Core MVC app works. So let's just get into it. Again, what we're going to build here is a web app or a web application. Okay, I'm going to stop for a second because my nose is running. Sorry. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so let's talk about this. All right, let's start going over the stuff that is in chapter 1 of this book. The first thing, as you can see, that's in here is an introduction to web applications. All right, so a web app consists of a set of web pages generated in response to user requests. Okay, and that's what the internet is full of. So let's talk about the components of a web application. I'm going to go over to the picture because I think it does a little bit better job of explaining it. Now, back when I started teaching this stuff, what you'd see here basically, you wouldn't see tablet, you wouldn't see smartphone. It would just be a bunch of computers in here connected to the internet, all right, and a web server. But now, as you know, there's smart appliances, there's smart cars, etc. But when we're talking in here about the components, we're talking about clients, a web server, and a network. What do I mean? The clients here are the computer, the tablet, and the smartphone. They're everything and everyone that's using the internet. The web server is basically, you can look at it as basically the holder of information. So when you need something, for example, if I were to go out to my former employer, I should say, his website, rankin.edu, there's a web server out there someplace that's going to present the information back. So again, if I go out there and just go out here to rankin.edu, that's going to give me some information. All right, and hopefully that, like I said, that makes sense to people. So they show here the components of, this is a URL, HTTPS, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, secure. All right, there's the domain name, www.murach.com. There's the path, and there's the file. Now, normally if you leave this off, it'll default to index.html. All right, so as it says, clients use browsers to request web pages from a server. And as I mentioned, clients can be a lot of different things. The web server returns the pages requested. A network connects clients to a web server. And there's basically 2 types of networks. Well, there's really more than that. But the 2 that you talk about most often are LANs, a local area network, and WANs, a wide area network. As an example, where I used to work, the computers in the classrooms were literally connected to one another. They were in the same building, and there was a physical connection between them. That was a local area network. On the other hand, Rankin now has probably 4 or 5 different campuses. It used to have only 2, or it used to have only one, the one in St. Louis, and then they built the one in Wentzville, Missouri. And those 2 campuses are about 40 miles apart. Well, there's no way they're going to lay 40 miles worth of cable underneath to connect those 2. All right? So with that, it's a wide area network where they are connected, but not physically connected to one another. So the network is used to connect clients to a web server. When you request a page, you put in a URL, like we see right here. I just kind of mentioned to you an intranet and an internet, okay? The internet is basically a series of WANs, series of wide area networks. The cloud, as it says, refers to the software and services that run on the internet. There's the cloud right there. Okay? An ISP or an internet service provider owns a WAN connected to the internet. Okay. Static pages. Now, with a static page, you go out and you request something, and it basically comes back as an HTML page. Chances are real good if you go back tomorrow and check, it'll look exactly the same. If you go back next week and check, it'll look exactly the same. It's not dynamic in that if I do go out to Rankin's here, what's going to change? Well, notice they've got here some managed consent thing I'd never seen before. They also have a tech bot that says, can I help you? But the point is, when do summer classes start? Well, you can see they start Monday, May 11th. Fine. Now, will that change? The answer is yes, because, for example, after May 11th, they'll probably put something else out there. All right? But they have to physically go in and make a change if they want to have something that's going to change. In other words, it doesn't change on the fly. So when you have a simple request that comes in, all right, and it's not going to change much. This is an HTTP and Hypertext Transfer Protocol request, and it's a response. You request from your browser by putting in some kind of a URL, typically. Your response is going to typically be back with some combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML, the hypertext markup language, CSS, cascading style sheets. Now, this request, you don't put it in like this, but you putting in something like this is going to generate some kind of an HTTP request like it says. And a response will come back. Again, for yours, it might be code that looks like this, but you won't see this. All right? So as it says, 3 protocols that web apps depend on. HTTP, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTPS, and probably I'm not telling you something you don't already know. But, I've got members of my family that still call me up occasionally and ask me questions about computer things, some of which I know, some of which I don't know. I'm a software guy. I'm not real hardware savvy, but I'm a software guy. But one thing I've always told them is if you're going to go out to a site where you're going to buy something or give some kind of personal information, make sure that site is HTTPS because, as it says, it's used for a secure communication over a network. All right. There's also TCP/IP, which, as it says, is a suite of protocols that let computers communicate over a network. So, static web pages typically contain HTML. The HTML that it contains changes rarely. Some of it may never change. For instance, there's at least a chance if you come out to Rankin and you come out there a year from now, it might look exactly like this. It could look different. It might look exactly like this. That'll change. And that stuff that's in there will change. All right. So as it says, when the user requests a static web page, the browser sends an HTTP request to that web server. When it receives that request, it retrieves the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that it needs. So this is a request response type of setup. You request, the web server responds. Okay. Now, if you contrast that with a dynamic web page, notice what else is in here for a dynamic web page. All right. And you say, well, it's not much different. Well, it is different, because what you typically have in there is you want information that could change. For instance, if I go out to Rankin's website and I ask for classes that are available in the summer semester, okay, it'll give me that information. But if I go out there in fall, there's not going to be information for the summer classes for 2026. It would make no sense. But I could ask for information for fall 2026 classes, or maybe even spring 2027 classes. So a dynamic web page, as it says, it's generated by a program running on a server. And the system figures out there could be a lot of different servers in here. So the system will figure out what application server should be used to process and give you the information that you need. All right. Okay. So let's get into talking a little bit about MVC. All right. And I'm just going to start on this. I don't think I'll have enough time. I want to keep these down to about 20 minutes or so, these lectures. And I'm already, well, I'm at 21 already, so let's keep it down to 25, let's say. In fact, let's just stop right here, and we'll pick it up next time with an introduction to the MVC pattern. Okay, I'll be back with that shortly.